On behalf of the American Veterans Center, I'm honored to be here to introduce tonight's honoree. For those of you new to the American Veterans Center, I'd like to offer a warm welcome. Tonight's lecture is one of many projects throughout the year in which the AVC guards the legacy and honors the sacrifice of our military men and women of every generation. Over the last 2 decades, the AVC has collected thousands of oral histories from American veterans from the First World War to the present day. We've produced dozens of radio and television documentary programs, including the recently completed Doolittle's Raiders, A Final Toast, airing nationwide on public television this fall. And every Veterans Day weekend, we bring together hundreds of students from each of our nation's military academies in several dozen ROTC programs where they meet many of our nation's most distinguished veterans. At the AVC's annual conference, they're instilled with the virtues of leadership while gaining a better appreciation for our military's heroes past and present. That same weekend, the AVC produces The Honors, the first televised award show honoring our military veterans and active duty. This Veterans Day television special airs on cable nationwide every fall. And as many of you may have recently seen, the AVC sponsors and produces the National Memorial Day Parade, held annually along Constitution Avenue here in Washington, which we brought back after a 70-year absence from World War II. We revived it in 2005. It's now the nation's largest Memorial Day event, drawing some 300,000 spectators and a national television audience. Of our many programs, tonight's lecture is especially meaningful to us, honoring the memory of one of our great friends and mentors, General Andrew Goodpaster. It was conceived not only to honor his legacy, but to spotlight the work of fellow soldier scholars in his mold. Tonight's honoree most certainly fits that mold. He rose from PFC to lieutenant colonel over a 22-year Army career, where he largely served as a military intelligence officer. This career left him well suited for a second career as a writer and strategic thinker, publishing numerous essays in military journals such as Parameters and Military Review. He has also written for USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, The New York Post, among many other newspapers, and regularly appears on the Fox News channel. In addition to several nonfiction works, he also has the distinction of being the first Goodpaster Prize recipient to be a noted novelist. His latest work, Valley of the Shadow, is the latest in his acclaimed series on the Civil War, and his remarks tonight will draw from this work. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce one of our nation's preeminent soldier scholars and recipient of the 2015 Andrew Jackson Goodpaster Prize, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters.
You're a lucky audience. It is thundering and thumping down rain outside, so you timed it really well. I am so grateful for the award, so much so that I won't belabor the point. When I was working on my master's degree, I wrote a thesis on NATO's early formative decades. And of course, General Goodpaster had a very important role to play in that. I wish I could remember what I wrote. It's been a while. But I am honored and I thank you. Now, if I were a true Washingtonian, what I would do would be to begin by delivering carefully crafted, wonderfully humble remarks telling you how great I am. But since I'm not a good Washingtonian, rather I want to talk about leadership. And so although most of the characters I will discuss are drawn from the current book, Valley of the Shadow, I'll draw from other books and other research. And I'm calling this the Civil War and the Mysteries of Leadership. Because at the end of the day, at the end of many a long day throughout history, leadership at its highest levels remains a mystery. When I was a lieutenant, a second lieutenant, a first lieutenant, I dutifully read all the great military books I could get my hands on. And I was looking for the answer. How do you be a great leader? And you get a lot of valuable information along the way. And the military studies how to turn out leaders. And you can checklist certain things: integrity, sense of duty, care for the troops. But beyond the checklists, beyond the manuals, beyond the helpful hints in memoirs, there still is this great mystery. And leadership is not ultimately formulaic. Leadership comes in many, many varieties. I'm always astonished even limiting it to the Civil War alone, by the remarkable cast of leaders and the great variety. And so what I'd like to do tonight is to give you some snapshots, some oral snapshots of some of the men who particularly intrigued me. And some are professional soldiers, some are not. But they all did their best, north and south, to serve their country to the best of their abilities. And at times their achievements and their courage, their ability to galvanize soldiers to incredible acts of valor, again, still remains a mystery. And I'll start with someone who really should be the patron saint of soldiers who write books. And that is Volunteer General Lew Wallace, the forgotten man who served Washington. Now, can anybody tell me anything about Lew Wallace out there? Good, very good. He wrote Ben-Hur. And Lew Wallace was an Indiana man, a politician, would-be soldier. He served in Texas and northern Mexico briefly in the Mexican War, part of the local militia out in Indiana. And when the war came, he was actually much better prepared than many of the other men who had become political generals, as they were called. Well, Lew Wallace was very dutiful, strong sense of duty to the country, believed in the Union. He wasn't a West Pointer. That was one strike against him in the West, because General Henry Halleck, before he came east, Halleck was called Old Brains. That was his nickname. And he actually said, and I'm paraphrasing, that volunteer generals were no better than criminals. He felt that if you weren't a West Pointer, you simply couldn't do it. Well, the interesting thing about Lew Wallace is he did do it. At Fort Donelson, Grant's first really important victory, Grant's on the river when the Confederates launched their attack, their sally from the fort. Grant's talking to the naval commander on the river, and Lew Wallace is under orders to stay where he is and not move. Well, Lew Wallace sees that the Union line to his right is collapsing, and he disobeys orders and attacks and saves the day. Fort Donelson falls. Fast forward to Shiloh, a few months later. At Shiloh, Lew Wallace tries very hard to obey his orders to the letter, but they're very vague orders. The situation overtakes the orders, and Shiloh is such a near-run thing. The first day is such a disaster that they need a scapegoat. And really, as much as I admire Grant and Sherman, the first day at Shiloh was not their finest hour. Now, they fought hard, they pulled through, but they let their guard down, made false assumption. The army was not prepared. Lew Wallace, who's several miles distant, gets an order to march, but the route he's told to take is the wrong route. He does his best. He gets there by the evening. Well, Henry Halleck is the grand wazoo in the West at this point, and he decides that everything that happened went wrong was Lew Wallace's sake and fault. So Lew Wallace is sent back, packing back to Indiana. He's cooling his heels. He wants to be back in the fight. During Morgan's raid, he actually saves the city of Cincinnati in neighboring Ohio. He still can't get back in. Finally, his supporters, and there's politics on all sides of this, his supporters do get Lew Wallace reinstated in active service in a military district centered on Baltimore, hardly the front lines. Wallace has no troops under his command except some invalids, some guards, some rotating militia. He does his best. His number one duty at first is to make sure the elections run smoothly. He does that all right. Well, then in the summer, early summer of 1864, something happens. And all the intelligence services of the Union Army, all the intelligence work in Washington, all the information gatherers totally miss Jubal Early and between 16 and 20,000 Confederates storming up the Valley of Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, into Maryland and toward Washington. They're on a raid. They're going to take Washington. And Grant is convinced nobody, and I admire Grant, but we all have our faults. He's convinced nobody has left Lee's lines. He's pinned them all down. And he keeps getting these reports and dismissing them. The only person getting good intelligence is the head of the B&O Railroad, headquartered in Baltimore. And he takes the reports from his station master who say the Confederates are here in strength, they're tearing up tracks, takes them to Lew Wallace. And Lew Wallace believes them. He's the only guy north of the Potomac that believes any of this. Washington keeps poo-pooing the rumors that Early's coming. Early is nearly to Frederick. Lew Wallace, on his own initiative, and his western boundary is the Monocacy River, which flows, of course, just south of Frederick. Lew Wallace gathers up what we call the clerks and jerks, invalids, some militias, and he gets between 2,000 and 3,000 raw recruits and militiamen out there at Frederick. He gets a battery of artillery, really only 2 functional guns in the key part of the battle. And finally, he gets some regular cavalry who are kind of passing through, and he grabs them. And Early is leading combat veterans of the Army of Northern Virginia. And Lew Wallace is determined to make a stand, because he knows now everything's about time. And he's on the Monocacy. He's got his advance guard, as it were, west of Frederick, trying to delay an entire army marching as hard as they can for Frederick and then Washington. He's not sure if they're going to Baltimore or Washington, but he bets on Washington. And finally, Washington wakes up. Grant wakes up. They start rushing forces, the elements of the 6th Corps, up to Annapolis and to Washington, but they're running late. It's close. Just the day before, Early is about to hit Wallace's main position, brilliantly and beautifully chosen on the south bank of the Monocacy River. Regiments start arriving. He gets about 2/3 of Jim Ricketts' division from the 6th Corps, which brings him up to a total of under 6,000 men, half of whom are again green recruits. You got about 16,000 Confederates at this point, because they're peeling some off. And Early, he's heard there's just nothing out there but militia. He thinks he'll storm over them. Lew Wallace and another forgotten man, James Ricketts, multiple wounds, a very, very brave general. He's not handsome. He's not the kind of guy that electrifies the media. And they make this stand on the Monocacy. It's dramatized in the book, but it's incredible what they do. Brilliant tactics, finely chosen terrain. They hold Early off, from early in the morning to late afternoon, when finally they're enveloped, they're collapsing, and Wallace gives Ricketts a chance to rescue his division and get them out of there in mid-afternoon. And Ricketts won't do it. They stay and they fight, take tremendous casualties, but they buy a day. As a result of that kind of leadership, Lew Wallace, who's out of favor, taking risks, daring, doing what has to be done. Jim Ricketts, Wallace has no authority over him when his troops start arriving by train. They're supposed to go to Harper's Ferry, which would taken them out of the battle and out of Early's path. Jim Ricketts on his own decides, no, the fight is here, I'll stay. They're risking court-martials and worse, but they save the Union. When the Confederates finally, in terribly hot weather, on forced marches, 2 days later, they literally get within sight of the newly completed Capitol Dome. And within the same hour that the Confederate skirmishers are approaching the Washington defenses, the 6th Corps is marching up 7th Street and filling into the forts. Within 1 hour. Had they not made that stand on the Monocacy, virtually forgotten today, Early would have seized Washington and burned it and left, so Washington would have been burned twice. Now, what's the leadership lesson of that? Well, obviously, there are many lessons. You can draw them yourselves. But sometimes that personal moral courage to do what you believe is right, even though you know there will be penalties, and there were penalties, that's critical. Now, Lew Wallace, the thanks he gets, Henry Halleck persuades everyone that his stand on Monocacy, wasted lives, was a debacle, and Wallace is fired in disgrace. Now, when Jim Ricketts and others start telling the story, he's finally reinstated at his rank, etc., but he's never given a combat command again, because the Indiana politics, Lincoln needs Indiana. They do not want Lew Wallace to be a successful politician after the war, so he can't be given a command. It was even more political then than it is now. But there's a coda. Grant makes him governor of the New Mexico territories after the war, because Grant knows what he did. in the then crumbling Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, he completes Ben-Hur while dealing with Billy the Kid in the Lincoln County Range War. Well, that all sounds like enough for one career. Later, he's appointed the equivalent of an ambassador, we didn't call them ambassadors then, to the Sublime Porte, the Sultan's court in Constantinople, or Istanbul. Well, Lew Wallace, being Lew Wallace and a proud Hoosier and a Midwestern guy, gets to the court, which is over-regulated to say the least. And at the first encounter with the Sultan, the first audience, he just walks out and sticks out his hand. And the Sultan is, what the, whiskey tango foxtrot. But he takes Lew Wallace's hand, and Lew Wallace becomes his first Western advisor. And the Sultan, they're as close to being friends as you can be in the circumstances. When the presidential administrations changed back in the States, and Wallace is recalled because the spoils system was very active, the Sultan personally sends a letter to the American president saying, how can a mere change of presidents rob me of my friend Lew Wallace? So Lew Wallace, after that, goes back, starts a writer's renaissance in Indiana, and does public service to the end of his days. A great leader. That's a little more than you needed about Lew Wallace, but I'm fascinated by these half-forgotten and forgotten figures. And then moved to the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. Now, one thing I worry about today's Army and military is the political correctness to the point where you dare not speak. Well, that wouldn't have washed in the Civil War, because as some of you may have heard me say in the past, we romanticize the Civil War. We put them up on pedestals, and everybody's clean and heroic and fine, and everybody speaks like a Victorian parson. They didn't. In the Shenandoah Valley confrontation between Early and Phil Sheridan in the late summer and early autumn of 1864, many lives could have been saved if these armies had just lined up and Phil Sheridan and Jubal Early had walked out in front of the armies and had a cursing contest. They were flamboyantly, imaginatively obscene, profane, call it what you will. And the men loved it. They just did. And the curious thing is, both of these men serve leaders who really don't use obscenity. Robert E. Lee absolutely is obsessed with the ideals of being basically a Regency-era gentleman in British terms. And he's locked. His code is locked in the 1820s and 1830s. His speech patterns are, Lee, you dare not curse around Lee. You just don't do it. Well, Early gets away with it. Harry Heath can get away with it. And then Grant doesn't use obscenity. Once in a while he'll say damn. He doesn't. But he's amused by people who do, like his key aide, John Rawlins, and Sheridan. He loves Sheridan. And Sheridan will go off on these wild Irish madcap tirades, and Grant just sort of sits there smiling and laughing. Well, the lesson of this is not that you have to curse like my old drill sergeant to be a successful leader, but it's that leaders come in many forms. You get the incredibly inspirational Robert E. Lee, who is a rigid gentleman, and you get Jubal Early. Now, Jubal Early, like so many of the Confederate generals who performed well, Lee, Early, Wade Hampton, he was strongly opposed to secession. He went to the Virginia Convention, made speeches against it, fought against it. But as Wade Hampton opposed secession in the Carolinas. And when their states seceded, they went with their states. But Early's a crotchety guy. From the Mexican War, he got rheumatism. He's big, but he's bent over. He has a beard that's always stained with tobacco juice. Really ugly. He's fathered several illegitimate children by a poor white woman he keeps in a hill up above his hometown back in Rocky Point, Virginia. He's not a clean-living man, but he's a fighter. Now, here's the interesting thing about Early. Early is not charismatic. He doesn't really inspire troops, but he leads. He's a good leader, and the troops initially at least trust him to make the right decisions. Now, Early gets a bad rap, but Jubal Early, when you look at what he did, he is always outnumbered by Sheridan at least 2 to 3 to 1, sometimes 3 to 4 to 1. Lee never fires Early, despite the fact that the Richmond papers keep attacking him because he keeps losing. But Lee knows that there's nobody better. Nobody else could do better. Now, Phil Sheridan, while they share a taste for colorful language, as they called it at the time. Phil Sheridan's his opposite. Phil Sheridan is a runny little Irishman with a funny-shaped head. That's why he always wears that sort of flattened pork pie hat. It's the only hat that'll really fit him and look decent. He has a huge torso, short legs, long arms. Even Lincoln makes fun of him. But Sheridan has the magic. Soldiers just respond to him. They love him. He can rally troops just by riding by. And that's one of the things that's always fascinated me. You know, you do in your military careers meet some people who are absolutely charismatic. Now, I take the current recent generation of generals, you know, Marine General Jim Mattis. Jim, he's better looking than Chesty Puller was, but he's not going to win a beauty contest. But he's like Sheridan. He could just, troops loved him. He inspired the troops. And Sheridan, while Early does the best he can, Sheridan keeps making mistakes. He's rescued at 3rd Winchester or Peckin Creek by his subordinates. The General Crook, one of his subordinates, who Sheridan in his later years will betray his old friend Crook, claiming Sheridan wants to claim credit for every single decision himself. Crook saves him at 3rd Winchester, and then Crook comes up with a plan for Fisher's Hill, the flank on the mountainside. But Sheridan is very much a classic, not a political general. He's a general who's a politician. And with Sheridan, he takes good care of his subordinates during the war and for the years afterwards. He's ruthless in cutting down his peers, and he's slavish in his subservience to Grant. He knows where his bread is buttered. He's not really an attractive figure as an individual. He's somewhat duplicitous, but he's incredibly brave, and soldiers love him. And jumping ahead to the climactic Battle of the Valley campaign at Cedar Creek, Early, advised by John Brown Gordon, who I may have time to get to, stages one of the great surprise attacks in all of military history. Wildly outnumbered, outgunned, tired, unfed, Early's troops, with Gordon, John Brown Gordon, leading the flank attack, they just run over 2 Union Corps, are in the process of destroying a third, the veteran 6th Corps. Only the Vermont Brigade stands, and really one division making a stand right by Middletown, saves some of the army. Sheridan's just coming back from Washington. He's in Winchester. He's about 15 miles from the battle scene. And he gets up, he hears the guns, he doesn't know what it is at first, he knows there's supposed to be a reconnaissance of force by his people. But when he starts riding south and getting reports, suddenly he sees there are soldiers that have run for miles. The army is fleeing, it's disintegrated. And Sheridan, on his huge, this wonderful horse he has, and I'm blanking out on the name, I'm sure you all remember it, a Rienzi, named after the Wagner's opera. And Rienzi, he has this big torso, he's impressive on horseback. He just starts riding south with his staff trying to keep up. And he's giving orders as he goes along and rallying men. And this army, his Army of the Valley, it has been defeated. It has been crushed. They're just trying to survive. And the cavalry, by the way, helps cover what everybody thinks is going to be a retreat. Sheridan he rallies people, gets to the battlefield. Someone turns to him and says, "We believe we can do an orderly withdrawal." And Sheridan says, "We're not going anywhere." And he starts riding by the troops who are reforming, and their officers are trying to gather them in. And he said, "Men, we're going to sleep in the same tents and the same grounds we slept in last night." And he takes his time across several hours, gets the intelligence right, has the cavalry do the scouting that has to be done. And this broken army, just not even a half dozen hours after it has been utterly defeated, ran in terror, just fled. They turn around and they defeat a crushing defeat on Early's army. Now, there are various tactical reasons for it, but it's stunning what this man can do. So you have inspirational leadership. Lew Wallace and Jim Ricketts are not inspirational leaders. They're men with the courage to do the right thing. You get Sheridan, who's an inspirational leader, in my view, doesn't have nearly the ethical fiber of Lew Wallace or Jim Ricketts, who will always always to the end of his days regret his part in the Fitz-John Porter's court-martial. But again, they come in many flavors. They all share a sense of duty. But what are the limits of duty? Now, this is something I'm writing a book now on the Petersburg front, the Crater and Ream Station, Globe Tavern, Deep Bottom. It'll be a follow-on to this book in the summer and early autumn on the Petersburg-Richmond front in 1864. And there's some fascinating characters in that raise other questions, even if they don't give you the answers. And one was, where does duty stop? Now, those of you who served, I served from the 70s into the 90s, and those of you who served even earlier know, in the Army and Marines, and I suspect the other services, you're supposed to just stand to your post, whatever. No matter how sick you are, no matter how tired, you're supposed to be able to stay awake for 2 weeks running and make good decisions all the while. And human beings do have limits. So you have Francis Channing Barlow. Now, Francis Channing Barlow was a Harvard class of 1855 valedictorian. Brilliant man from old New England bloodlines on both sides. However, his father is a preacher who basically goes mad, goes totally off the reservation, leaves his mother. His mother's a famous beauty, and he grows up in genteel poverty that's not always genteel. He lives on a commune at Brook Farm for a while. Some of you may know about the whole Concord movement. And he's a brilliant man, Barlow. He's quirky. He's strange. He's the kind of guy that really never really gains close friends. You can't get that close to Barlow. But he's incredibly brave. He's as close to fearless, which is almost to the point of a mental disorder as you can. Now, he volunteers early on as a private, of course, rises rapidly through the Army ranks, through the volunteer ranks. He's repeatedly badly wounded. At Gettysburg, he's wounded, captured by the Confederates. He's left behind because they assume he's going to die. By early 1864, he's back leading a division in the Army of the Potomac. And Barlow, he learns fast. At Gettysburg, where there's a monument to Barlow at Gettysburg, his worst day of the war, when he made a terrible mistake and uncovered the right wing of the 11th Corps. And it turns into a disaster. But everybody keeps him in the Army because they know he's a fighter. And he's a guy who breaks Lee's lines at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania. He's just incredibly brave. But and here's the key thing about these generals. When you read the history books about them, you say, well, why did they do this or that? They were almost all of them suffering from multiple wounds. It was rare for general officers not to have been wounded at least once or twice. The big killer in the Civil War, as many of you know, is dysentery, aggravated diarrhea. Now, this is in the days before aspirin. These men are suffering from wounds. A guy I love, a Confederate lieutenant colonel named Colonel William C. Oates, 15th Alabama. He's leading his troops into battle with a shot-up hip, and he's just limping along, leading them with a sword. But Barlow, by the midsummer, by July, he is truly ill. With dysentery, he's got what clearly was a bad foot infection. He's got intermittent toothache. His wounds are bothering him terribly, and he's sicker and sicker. He's getting the heat in July and August is always bad in Tidewater, Virginia. That year was really, really hot. But Barlow, and he's sick. People are starting to hinting, you're too sick to lead. You really should recover. He won't quit. He sees his duty to be there. And oh, by the way, on the battlefield of the First Deep Bottom, he learns that his wife has just died of typhus. She was nursing soldiers to be by her husband. It's actually quite a touching love story, but don't have time for that. So Barlow sticks. It really is a moving one. And Barlow will later, after the war, go on to marry Ellen Gould Shaw, a sister of Robert Gould Shaw, who led the 54th Massachusetts at Battery Wagner. You see in the film Glory. Now, the story on Bob Shaw, is that Barlow tutored him through Harvard. He wasn't very bright. He wasn't particularly an abolitionist, but his mother was a dragon lady, and she was ferociously abolitionist, and she basically forces Robert Gould Shaw to take command of the 54th Massachusetts. Not exactly like the film. But Barlow, so all these New England families all volunteer. Lowell is going to die on the battlefield at Cedar Creek. I mean, all these names that are associated with early American history, they're volunteers. But Barlow, Francis Channing Barlow, he takes a leave, buries his wife, comes back, and he is sick, and he doesn't know when to quit. You've got to know when to quit. And he doesn't as a result of Second Deep Bottom. Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock, the Corps commander, commanding the entire wing of the Army now, he's grooming Barlow to take over the Corps because Hancock knows he's so sick from his wounds, he's going to have to leave. Well, Barlow botches it terribly. He sends in his forces piecemeal. He does everything he's torn other officers apart from doing. And finally, he virtually collapses. He goes back to the hospital at City Point. Should be the end of the story. This man is truly, truly ill. Now, about 5 days later, he pops back up to retake command of his division at Reams Station. And the Confederates are ready to attack. Barlow collapses again. This time he has to be carried off. He's done. But he did real harm because he was trying to do his duty beyond the limits of common sense. So again, all these questions come up for me personally. What are the limits of duty? His subordinate, Nelson Miles, who went on to be a great Indian fighter, takes over the division from Barlow. Now, Nelson Miles was a clerk in a crockery store in Boston who fantasized about military glory. Before the war, he joins the militia. He takes lessons in drill from a dubious French colonel. He'll do anything. And he gets the war. Nelson Miles is one of those people who's a natural soldier. And he does tremendously well. And he's a protege of Francis Channing Barlow, all the way up. But then he tries to hint that Barlow needs to get off stage, that he's too sick. But you can only go so far. And Nelson Miles is dealing with the issues of, well, where does loyalty go? Does it go to Frank Barlow, who's moved me up to be a 24-year-old brigadier general? And by the way, in the Civil War, the problem wasn't the young generals, it was the old generals. They had to make this transition to modern warfare. But Nelson Miles, is the loyalty to the troops? Is it to the mission? Whenever I encounter books on leadership, they don't ask those hard questions. You know, where is the ultimate loyalty? To the cause, to the flag, to your friend, to your soldiers, to the mission of the day, which might be a stupid mission? I don't have the answers to these, but history at least gives us some background to begin to ask the right questions. And then you have people, back to the Shenandoah Valley, John Brown Gordon, just a wonderful, wonderful Georgian, who is the kind of guy I've always said, he's the kind of guy that will entertain everybody at the dinner table, but will never pick up the check. He's incredibly charming, cavalier, has a great love story with his wife, who follows him all over the war. His wife, when the Confederate Army, Early's army is collapsing at 3rd Winchester, she's out in the streets of Winchester telling those soldiers to get back in line, and General Gordon's going to be after them if they don't. And General Gordon is another of those guys who's naturally charismatic. Just charming, tall, handsome, and he is also a fine, fine soldier. But his problem is he's not, he and Early just don't get along, because Early's this bent-over guy with a stained beard, and Gordon's just this dashing George Clooney type of guy, and Early just plain resents it. So what do you do with a situation like that? Well, what Gordon does is he soldiers on, but the tension is always there. And the tension between Gordon and Early, who could have been a brilliant team, the tension badly hurts the Confederate cause. Well, then what do you do with the sociopaths and psychopaths? Another boy general, George Armstrong Custer. In the war, in his early 20s, he's a brigadier general, jumped from captain to brigadier general by just on the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg. Custer loves war. He loves war. I mean, he loves to get out there with a saber and fight and kill people. And there are a number of cavalrymen like that. But Custer, he's a brilliant, brilliant soldier, but he has to be controlled. And Phil Sheridan is the one guy who can control him and use him well. And Custer worries during the war that after the war, he'll be forgotten. That nothing will, out in the West, he's going to go back to the plains. He knows that if he's going to stay in the Army. But the curious thing about the Little Bighorn is Custer was trying to do exactly what worked out for him on one Civil War battlefield after another. His favorite technique was to split his forces, fix the enemy, and have the other part of his force envelop them. It just didn't work out in the Dakota territories. But again, there's so many of these people wouldn't work in today's military. Custer is not the kind of guy you want in peacetime. He narrowly avoids after the war getting kicked out of the service because he decides to take the 7th Cavalry on a several hundred-mile trek to visit his wife, who he misses. Now, you're probably not supposed to do that. But nonetheless, in wartime, you need these guys who are killers, who are ruthless killers. And we want everybody to be polite all the time. That does also concern me. So let me get to the opposite of Custer. Another guy who you might know in a different context. Rudd Haze. Rudd Haze, early middle age, Ohio man. And there were actually mafias in these armies, sort of political groupings. In Lee's army of Northern Virginia is really hampered by the fact that Lee can't help himself. He shows favoritism toward Virginians. Virginians run that army. Everybody else will be second tier. All the intimates, Lee's intimates, are all Virginians. And the Alabamans recognize it. And the Georgians recognize it. The Carolinians recognize it. Now, in the North, it's a little different. It's not that exclusive, but there's our old boys club. George Gordon Meade, Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, his chief of staff, later Corps commander, brilliant soldier. They're from Philadelphia. Winfield Scott Hancock's from Norristown, just outside of Philadelphia. There are a whole bunch of other Philadelphians in it. Then there's this Ohio political mafia that's going to include Rudd Haze, also known as Rutherford B. Hayes, and his protege, William McKinley. Now, as soon as I say political mafias, you get the idea of, well, the spoils system, Tammany Hall, that. Rutherford B. Hayes may have been the most ethical senior politician in American history. But first he fights in the Civil War. And Rudd Haze is a colonel, commanding a brigade, then a division. Later he'll be promoted to general near the war's end. But he always said he didn't care about rank. He just wanted to be one of the good colonels who fought the war. And Rudd Haze, unlike Custer, Rudd Haze hates war. I mean, he just hates it. But he does his duty. He's a very literate man, well-educated, adores his wife, wants to be back with his family. One of his children dies. Many of these generals have children die during the war. It really hurts Longstreet's performance. Personal lives do matter. But anyway, Rudd Haze, brigade commander on the field of 3rd Winchester. And he's ordered forward. The day is not going well for Sheridan, even though Sheridan had surprise. He wouldn't listen to Crook, wouldn't listen to anybody. Pig-headed, bull-headed guy. And Rudd Haze is on this flanking mission. And the day is close. The Confederates, are doing a tremendously powerful defense, although they're getting, the noose is closing around them. But it still can go either way. Where Rudd Haze is told to, you cross the streams, he crosses little streams, swing to the west, and recross the stream into the Confederate depths of the Confederate flank. Well, nobody knows the ground. He's never seen it before. And he does what he's told. And it turns out that little creek where he's crossing, ordered to cross, is a swamp. And the southern bank is high, and Confederates are on it. And before they know it, his brigade is just tumbling down into this ravine, into this swamp. His horse gets mired in the mud. He has to jump down in the mud. He can't get his boots out of the mud. His soldiers are being shot down by the Confederates who are having a high old time shooting him from the bank. They're dying all around him, his Indiana men, his West Virginia regiments. And the sensible military thing would have been to pull back. It looked like he couldn't win. His men are being slaughtered. Well, he wasn't a professional military man. He didn't know the rules. And he has this moment of doubt, clearly, where he has to decide what to do. And then we don't know what his exact words were, but it's basically, follow me. And Rudd Haze, this colonel, starts tromping through the mud for the far bank, pistol up, trying to keep the powder dry. And he is loved by his soldiers because his soldiers know he's always taking care of them. He's a truly caring, decent man. And the soldiers aren't going to let Haze go alone. And it's one of the most inspirational moments I've seen in the Civil War, where out of this swamp, these Union soldiers, they're all mixed together, they're bleeding, they're drowning in the water, and when they're wounded, they rally around him, and they start to make it onto the muddy the far bank, and they're clawing their way up, and more men are joining him, and he doesn't have time to reorder the regiment. It's just follow me again, and up the bank, right into the Confederates, and they drive them back. And more men start making it across, and Rudd Haze, they get up on the high ground, there's a battery there, it's swinging its guns to kill, it's charge. And Rudd Haze leads this virtual mob of his men who will follow him anywhere, turns a Confederate flank, pushes forward. He's exhausted. He's psychically drained. His brigade, he's got at most half of it with him, come up against a strong Confederate defense. He's wondering what to do. He thinks, this is as far as I can go. Then he gets the word that the division commander is down. He's now the division commander. He doesn't even know where the division is, but he starts finding out. And he rallies, his men will do anything for this guy. And he manages to get that division moving. And as the Confederate lines collapse, Rutherford B. Haze is his brigade, his old regiment, is the first regiment to reach the Winchester Courthouse. And an apocryphal story says, as one of his soldiers said to him, after this, Colonel, you're going to be governor. Well, Haze, and he's also, by the way, suffering. He's really allergic to poison ivy. He spent much of the war in West Virginia in the brambles. But Haze, he does what the Confederates, who are tough, the toughest infantry I've ever seen are the guys in the Army in Northern Virginia. But the Confederates think at Fisher's Hill. They're protected by the river on one side, steep mountain on the other. And Crook's guys and Haze' division especially, they're called the Mountain Creepers from West Virginia. And Haze sort of looks at that mountain and says, we can do that. Crook wants to know, can you get around that mountain? He said, yeah, we can do that. And Crook has 2 divisions in his corps. It's a small corps. And they both decide they can go around the mountain. Everybody's skeptical. The other corps commanders mock him. Sheridan's unsure. But Sheridan will take a risk. So Haze leads his troops, Indian file, across the side of a stony mountain, gets in behind the Confederates again, Fisher's Hill, deals them another great defeat. Now, he doesn't have as good a day at Cedar Creek, where his division is overrun, but he does his best. He fights. Anyway, he's a different kind of leader. He's a man who leads with ethics and honesty. John Gordon, he'll do anything to get ahead. He's going to go on to a distinguished career as governor or senator. Brilliant soldier, incredibly brave man, not terribly scrupulous. But they work. All these different styles of leadership work. Now, one thing they do have is they all lead from the front. A little different in the Union Army, though, because they lead from the front to a point. Division commanders don't lead charges. The Confederates, in love with the novels of Walter Scott, generals lead from the front. And as a result, Lee runs out of generals. Although some good ones come up later in the war, such as Billy Mahone, this guy who's about 5'4", an engineer, railroad engineer before the war, dyspeptic. Billy Mahone loves fancy uniforms. He travels with a cow, chickens, and a pastry cook. But he's the most ferocious division commander Lee has in the last year of the war, the man who turns a tide at the crater. And the crater is another story, very rarely told. It's one of the ugliest racial massacres in American history, with the massacres on both sides. Black troops, who remember the slaughter at Fort Pillow, initially show no quarter to the Confederates. The Confederates counterattack, show no quarter to the black troops. It is an ugly, ugly day, at the end of which, and you probably haven't heard this, the Union troops trapped in the crater, some of them turn on their fellow Union troops, who happen to be U.S. colored troops, and shoot them, or bayonet the black troops wearing the same uniform, because they hope the Confederates won't kill them. Now, one incident happens where a Union officer actually shoots a black soldier to show that he doesn't like black troops. The Confederates are so horrified by his treachery that they shoot him. Poetic justice. But anyway, Rudd Haze, I want to get back just briefly to Rudd Haze. I'm diverting myself because it's so rich in all these characters. Rudd Haze after the war. Rudd Haze, of course, becomes president in the disputed election of 1876, the original hanging Chad election, in which Frank Barlow plays an interesting part. But Rutherford B. Haze had promised when he ran, he said, if elected, I will serve 1 term. Well, Rudd Haze is the first president to try to reform the civil service. He's got to make compromises, basically ending Reconstruction, because that's how they can decide the election. But he dedicates much of the rest of his life to education for blacks and for legal protections for them. He refuses to intervene on the side of the ownership in the Great Strike of 1878 until the strikers start destroying property. By the time he leaves, he's ready to leave office and ready for the next election, he is absolutely loved by the American people. I mean, we don't think of Rutherford B. Hayes now unless it's a punchline and a late-night joke. He was loved. He was a good president who only made one great mistake, and I'll get to that in a moment. But he could have easily been reelected. But this is a politician most of his life. He says, no, I told the American people I would serve one term, I'm going home. And he went home. And he dedicated the rest of his life to education for blacks, for poor whites. And the highlight of his life was he'd hold reunions for his soldiers on his small farm. And they all came to the end of his days. The soldiers really loved that man. Now, Frank Barlow, another man who's quirky. Barlow is a merciless killer, but he has high ethics. And after the war, he goes back to New York. He's a lawyer. He's elected to various offices. He's Solicitor General of the State of New York, if I recall correctly. Might have the title just off. Fights the Tammany Hall, the Tweed Ring. And he's a Republican. And the Republicans figure, well, okay, he's our man. The disputed election of 1876 comes down to basically Louisiana and Florida. There are questions in other states. Well, the Republicans pull Frank Barlow to check on the ballots on one of the key counties in Florida, one of the disputed counties. And they're figuring, well, he's one of us. Well, Barlow comes back saying, no, the Democrats won this county. End of Barlow's political career. But he does go on to have a decent and successful life as an attorney. Well, anyway, again, what I'm trying to convey with hopefully some colorful stories that might interest you a little bit is that, first of all, these men in the Civil War there weren't bronze statues on marble pillars. They were real men with real quirks, with tremendous complexity. Some of them, like Rudd Hayes, they're afraid, but they do their duty and perform incredible acts of heroism. Others, like Custer, seem to feel no fear. He's virtually psychotic. You have some, like Robert E. Lee, who's obsessed with being a gentleman and can't see beyond Virginia. You have a man like Grant, who's failed at everything in his previous life, but has a genius for war. And even Grant's own subordinates don't get him. Sherman doesn't get him at first. Sherman has to learn. But Grant's the first guy in any army that I can find, European, North American, South American, he's the first guy to realize what modern war takes. The model, even for very fine generals, and George Gordon Meade's tremendously underrated. He won the Battle of Gettysburg against Robert E. Lee. But the model for all these generals on both sides is a Napoleonic or a Frederiциan model, where you march out, you fight a battle, somebody wins, somebody loses, and both go back to your corners and lick your wounds and replenish. And then a while later, you go out and fight another battle or have another campaign. And Grant's insight is that war has to be constant. In modern war, you must grind the enemy down. And yes, there is attrition, but as a percentage of forces engaged, Lee's losses are consistently higher than Grant's, except at Cold Harbor. Grant knows what it takes to win. He's also the first general who divorces himself from the battlefield. He only occasionally goes forward to see the fighting. He doesn't want to see the wounded. He hates hospitals because he knows he can't let it. He's actually a tender-hearted man. He can't stand cruelty to animals. He needs his beef cooked black. He can't handle if there's any blood in it. He knows his conscience will get the better of him if he goes forward. And he doesn't. And he knows the most merciful thing is to win the war. And the one man in the North who gets it isn't in uniform. It's Abraham Lincoln, which is another breed of leadership entirely. So the point of this short, hopelessly inadequate talk this evening was to try to give you a feel for the variety of leadership then. And I suspect were we ever, God forbid, to have to fight a major war today, we would see a wide variety of leaders emerge after the great peacetime leaders were swept aside. But the Civil War, I'm fascinated by it because it formed the America we know. we're still dealing with its reverberations, as we recently saw or see now in some of the southern states, 150 years later. History has very long curves. It's a war worth studying, certainly for exercises in command, to understand your history, and to consider the fact that you'll hear people saying, well, our country's never been so divided. 750,000 Americans died in our Civil War. I'd say we were slightly more divided then. So at any rate, these people were real flesh and blood human beings with lust, with passion, with hunger for power, with fear, with head lice, with dysentery. What's amazing about them, when you get up beyond the little lines in the maps and history books, is how much they transcended pain and fear to fight the war that decided we would be one nation, under God, indivisible. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Questions?
In the back. The microphone is coming to you.
This may be a little bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it from the naval perspective. All the leadership that you commented on, of course, was Army leadership.
Yeah.
Do you have any feel for the leadership style of, like, Admiral Farragut? Can you compare and contrast maybe what the leadership styles are or needs of a naval commander versus a Army commander?
Yeah, the naval commander has to be able to swim. But no, I really can't, because I'm writing about the Army. It's not to neglect the Navy, but that's what I know. I'm a boots on the ground kind of guy. But what strikes me about the Navy in the Civil War, its most important operations, other than the blockade, are riverine operations. It's a brown water Navy to a great extent, and the joint operations in the West with Porter and Grant, their cooperation is just a model for joint action. It's really, really impressive. Farragut is in just the great naval tradition of damn the torpedoes and full speed ahead. I mean, the United States Navy, to me, as an Army guy, it has a tradition that goes back to the Continental Navy, which was small and had to be ferocious. And so our Navy traditionally has been a ferocious, in harm's way Navy. Go get them. And it was frustrating for the blue water sailors in the Civil War because they didn't have a Confederate Navy to fight. I mean, you have actions, around Hampton Roads, of course, but they're blue water, brown water. But the Confederates rely on privateers, such as the famous Alabama, the Savannah, and they're commerce raiders. They're not interested in duking it out. And they finally get cornered by the Kearsarge off Cherbourg. It proves that, the Union gunnery is vastly better because Confederates have just been sinking whaling vessels. So it's a tough war for the Navy in the sense that they don't get the glory that the Army does. It's a ground war, and yet the naval blockade is essential. And Winfield Scott, as opposed to Winfield Scott Hancock, the elder, Winfield Scott, was mocked at the beginning of the war for the anaconda plan, for the idea that you had to surround the South like an anaconda snake. But that's ultimately what won the war, as far as logistics go. And another point, though, is the Navy was great at delivering supplies. I mean, that doesn't sound very romantic, but they did. I mean, the naval cooperation, Grant comes east. Grant loves working with the Navy. He has no inter-service rivalry. And with the James River Fleet, together they build a logistics city at City Point, a hospital that's cordons off about 100 acres. It's amazing. And the James River Fleet does a very fine job of supporting the Army with naval gunnery, heavy guns, etc. So the cooperation there is just absolutely superb. And naval Army cooperation it's good in the Spanish-American War, and then we get this inter-service rivalry growing up more and more Navy versus Army, Marines versus Army. Then the Air Force comes along and everybody hates the Air Force. If I can, one thing I think we've made progress on, but still have a long way to go on, is the generals and admirals today need to remember it's not about your rank, it's not about working for Lockheed Martin or Bath Iron Works after you retire. It's about duty to the country. And sometimes that means the Air Force has to give the Army a little something. Sometimes it means the Army has to give the Navy a little something. I'm really troubled by the budget squabbles. Now, that's off subject, I know. But my God, we got to all play on the same team, because you know what the bad guys do. Okay. Luke.
Why do you portray most all generals except Grant as cursing and drinking men, as opposed to clean-spoken and temperate people?
Well, because I portrayed all of them as they were. Some of them were very, very clean-spoken men. Religion was a very important part of life for many Civil War leaders and soldiers. But soldiers who'd served on the frontier, whether they wore blue or gray in the Civil War, men who'd served long years, even decades, on the Western frontier in the Seminole Wars, they really didn't speak like seminary students. And so, in some cases, I actually try to play the obscenity down a bit, because in a case of somebody like Sheridan or Early, if he went full bore, it really would be offensive. But I'm trying, in all these, Luke, I'm trying to be true to history, as true as I can, as accurate. I mean, I want to know what the weather was like, not just on a day, but at a given time of day. And so I'm trying to, as best I can, within the limits of whatever talent I may have, to just give people a more accurate version of how these historical figures were. It takes nothing, soldiers in the heat of battle, when they're trying to feel around if they have any more ammunition left and the enemy's coming at them and everybody's screaming and wounded men on all sides, they rarely say, "Oh my, I believe I've misplaced my bullets." So it can be a bit much for some folks. I understand it, because we're conditioned by a heroic version of history to believe that all these men were flawless and noble. They weren't. To me, what's great about them is they overcome their human frailties to lead. And sometimes that human frailties was vented in profane language. And from my own period in service in the Army as an enlisted man, before things became politically correct, I can tell you also that some of the obscenity rose to the level of folk poetry. That's the best answer I can give you. I'm sure everybody, some of you can sing, could stand up and sing "Up Jumped the Monkey in a Coconut Grove." But questions? Or is everybody hungry? Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for braving the weather and coming this evening.